Chris Stringer is the research leader of human evolution at the Department of Earth Sciences at the Natural History Museum. He's a fellow of the Royal Society and honorary fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, or Antiquaries. He is also a member of the American Philosophical Society, which is really interesting. And Chris has a string of intellectual achievements behind him, but he's known all over the world for his Out of Africa theories about the origins of modern humans. And it's my real pleasure to welcome Chris to this virtual discussion today. So on behalf of Humanistically Speaking magazine, welcome and thank you so much, Chris, for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. We're here to discuss his latest book about the origins, about our origins, entitled Our Human Story. And if you can see that. And I have to say, having read through it, that it's a stunningly beautiful book and it's filled to the brim with information, with explanations, photographs, and reconstructions of ancient human gatherings that I think personally are nothing less than fine works of art. I don't know who actually did that work, Chris, but whoever did it, I think, they did a wonderful job. But almost as fascinating as our own past, I think Chris's own personal past bears some review. As an East London lad, his formative years would have been in the 1950s. He became fascinated in anthropology after visits to the Natural History Museum and became so involved that he became a regular visitor and soon began doing his own research. Now, the bug hit early with Chris, and even at the age of 10, he did a project on Neanderthals before developing skills at age 12 in drawing skulls. So let me ask you first about your background before we get onto the main menu. I was born in North London at about the same time that you were born in East London. I too was fascinated by paleontology at about the same age as you, and I visited the Natural History Museum almost every free day I had. But I never for one moment believed that I could ever aspire to actually being a scientist. And I think that lack of self-belief was common among working class kids at that time. So I do wonder, where does a working class boy from East London find the confidence and self-belief that he could do that? So I wonder if there was a parent or a teacher in your life that gave you that inspiration.
Yeah, well, there were certainly difficulties and obstacles along the way, undoubtedly. But yes, I mean, my parents, first of all, were very supportive. So they took me to the Natural History Museum from the age of 5. I went on holiday to an aunt's in Wales and Penarth Bay, which happens to be a nice fossil locality. And so on the beach there, again, when I was less than 10 years old, I was collecting ammonites from the beach at Penarth. So that interest in fossils was there early on. And I had, in fact, one of my first memories of infant school, so age 5, one of my earliest memories is Miss Palmer, our teacher, getting us to make out of paper mache and sticks and matchsticks a Mesolithic village, a lake village. So this I now know is one of these Mesolithic villages from Switzerland. But yes, we made this big lake village out of matchsticks and newspapers and God knows what. And it was the star exhibit at the first open day when I was 5. My parents came in and here was this, we all contributed, of course, but Miss Palmer set this up, and that's one of my earliest memories, is making this Mesolithic lake village. And then, so I had in my first year at junior school, Mr. Moore, who had done a geology degree. He was the history teacher, but he obviously was interested in very ancient history. And we had BBC broadcasts called How Things Began. I don't know whether you heard those as well. These were radio broadcasts. Yeah. And there were these marvelous posters done by Maurice Wilson of the Earth at various times in the past, back in the Cambrian and the Jurassic, and one of them was a picture of Neanderthals burying a dead child. And I remember that poster vividly, which was up in the classroom. So that inspired my interest in Neanderthals too. And incredibly, when I got to the museum, right at the end of his life, I actually worked with Maurice Wilson on a book for the museum where he illustrated a number of human evolution subjects, and it was fantastic near the end of his life to tell him how he had inspired me as a young child. So yes, and aged about 9 or 10, I did a project on Neanderthal man, as we called it then, of course.
I must say, I'm impressed with your memory. I mean, Miss Palmer must have made an enormous impression on you. You were 5 years old at the time. And Mr. Moore, I mean, I'm not sure I can remember many of my teachers, but I can relate to your trip to Wales and looking for fossils, because I've taken all my grandchildren to look for fossils in Folkestone, because I think it's just so much fun. You know,
it is, yes. So so I remember those teachers. They left their mark. Not all teachers were so inspiring, of course, but those ones did leave their mark. And this project on Neanderthals, I wish I had it now. It would give me a good laugh, I'm sure, to see it. But in there, I was drawing skulls and family trees of Neanderthals and modern humans, and cutting out things. So Scientific American used to produce offprints of their articles. And my parents one day took me to Foyle's bookshop in Charing Cross Road, and there they were selling these Scientific American offprints of different articles. So there were, there's one by William Howells, who, again, I'll mention him probably later, someone I came to work with later on. Yeah. And these were articles on human evolution. So we didn't have photocopies in those days, so I copied some of the illustrations from the Scientific American offprints into my article on Neanderthals. So yeah, unfortunately I don't have it. I wish I did.
Scientific American as well. I mean, that's quite a heavy magazine for a young lad, even for an advanced 10-year-old. For me, my inspiration was dinosaurs, as this cup shows. It's quite coincidental.
Yes. I love dinosaurs too, of course. Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was a long time ago, but can you describe what your school project on Neanderthals was? Can you remember what it was?
Well, it was all done in a single exercise book. And I know I had, as I say, I drew different skulls in there. I seem to have a liking for drawing skulls, which did alarm a number of people, including my parents. I remember when I was young, there were, probably with you, there were bomb sites from the Second World War in the vicinity. Yes, so up the road, there was one of our main playgrounds was a bomb site where we used to go and play, and there was a dead cat in there, and I remember a friend and I sort of took it home. Again, pretty alarming to our parents.
I bet Mum was pleased.
Yeah. We tried to, and we cut it up and we took some of the skeleton out to look at it. So the interest was there, a bit macabre maybe, but
How old were you?
Then probably again about 9 or 10, I suppose. By then, maybe a bit younger. I can't remember how old I was for that. So all these things kind of added up, but I didn't seriously think there could ever be a career doing this. That was not something I imagined. And even at school, even in the sixth form, the careers advice, if you were reasonable at science, was to go into veterinary science or engineering or medicine. So I was on track to go to medical school. No one mentioned there was a subject called anthropology that you could study at university. I didn't know it existed. And it was a complete chance event that I found out it existed, because one of my friends went to for an interview at UCL for a physics degree, and he brought back the prospectus, and he said, "Oh, Stringer, have a look at that." And he threw it over, and it was alphabetic, and it opened on A for anthropology. So I read this entry, and here was a subject which had human evolution in there. Archaeology, social anthropology, and suddenly it appealed to me much more than medicine, because medicine, a fine career, of course, but it was just doing medicine. Here was a subject which was much broader, and I thought didn't pin me down so much. So I read up a bit about anthropology and decided that I'd try and apply for a degree there, having already got a place at London Hospital Medical School. I mentioned to my parents and to my biology teacher at school that I was going to also apply for anthropology, and they said I was mad and I'd never get a job doing that. And when I had a place at medical school, just do it, don't even think about it. But I phoned up, because this was well before the days of internets and letters were too slow. I actually phoned up the department, and in my best Cockney East London accent asked them whether it was too late to apply for the degree. And they told me they had one last entrance session for interviews and a little exam you had to do. And I went up to that. And I even remember the title of the essay we had was an incredible mouthful. It was "Public Hypocrisy is Often a Restatement of Ideal Values. Discuss." That was the essay. So we were given an hour to write an essay on that subject. So it was quite challenging. I wrote about the Profumo scandal, which of course was, you know, fairly.
I was in the early 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah. So anyway, that got me a place, and I wanted to accept it. As I say, my parents were mystified really, but they, to their credit, they said, "Look, if you really want to do it, okay, then take the place." So I did it, and I went to UCL to do anthropology and not medicine.
You know, it's an interesting thought that had you not heard of the word anthropology at the right time, you would probably now be a GP somewhere.
Well, being brought out of retirement to help with the COVID fight.
Oh, absolutely.
Or injecting vaccines into lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely.
A very honourable thing to do, of course.
Yeah.
And all credit to those who are doing it. But yes, that probably is where I'd be now. Yeah, if I hadn't gone down with COVID or something awful by then. Yeah, with the exposure.
I didn't even think about that. One thing that struck me, I mean, attitudes towards what kind of folk Neanderthals were have changed out of almost all recognition in our lifetimes. I mean, when I was young, I understood that Neanderthals were thick and stupid and, you know, a bit simple. But I just wonder, what was the turning point? Attitudes have changed dramatically. I know that we've discovered that Neanderthal brains were actually bigger than our brains, I believe. But what was the turning point?
On average, yes.
On average, yeah. Yes, I take what you're saying, Chris. But what do you think? Where was the beginning? When did people's attitudes about Neanderthals change from the man ape to more human than that? You think?
Yeah, so the pendulum has swung back to and fro. So as I mentioned, even in the 1950s, there was this Maurice Wilson painting of Neanderthals burying a child, which is obviously a very human depiction of Neanderthals. And he did a depiction of the Neanderthals at Gibraltar outside Gorham's Cave, which later on was a site I actually went to excavate in.
Because there have been Neanderthal graves that have been discovered with flowers around them and that sort of thing.
That's right. And so Maurice Wilson certainly depicted the Neanderthals as very human, family groups and so on. But yes, the overall image still was the shambling ape man was certainly the public image. And I think, yes, you mentioned the flower burial at Shanidar, and that was one of the times the pendulum swung in the direction of making the Neanderthals very like us, because Ralph Selecki, who led the excavations at Shanidar in Iraq, he wrote a book called Shanidar, the First Flower People. So this was, of course, in the 1960s, when flower power was the rage. And so, in a sense, the Neanderthals were almost being depicted as like children of nature, like sort of Paleolithic hippies almost, burying their dead with flowers. And that was a very human depiction of them. And there were people at the time like Loring Brace, the American anthropologist, who had the Neanderthals as virtually fully modern. They were our direct ancestors. So if there was a complete evolutionary sequence, we would see Neanderthals gradually evolving into modern humans.
Yes. And
so they had the basis of all the human behavior that we would expect to be there at a slightly earlier stage. So there were people like Brace who were, if you like, Neanderthal champions and had them as our direct ancestors. So when I began my PhD, I was really trying to look at these different ways of modeling the Neanderthals as direct ancestors or as a parallel line. So Bill Howells, I mentioned him already. So he wrote a book called Mankind in the Making. And there, his view was the Neanderthals were different from us. They were human, but they were a different kind of human, a different lineage. At that time, I don't think he went as far as to call them a different species, because the species idea, because they'd been named a different species back in 1864 by William King, based on the remains from the Neander Valley in Germany, the skeleton that had been found there. But by the time we get to the 1950s, the pendulum had swung away from that, and they were being regarded as a subspecies of Homo sapiens. So at the time I was doing my PhD, and I began that in 1970, most people classified the Neanderthals as a subspecies of our own species, Homo sapiens. So my PhD was trying to tease apart these different scenarios, and with studying, with measuring skulls, and I was back to my first love of skulls, measuring Neanderthal and modern human skulls, and then applying very primitive computer analyses to the data of these measurements to see whether the Neanderthals made good ancestors for modern humans, or whether there were other ancestors elsewhere that were more likely to be our ancestors than the Neanderthals were. And to cut a long story short, yes, my conclusions were that the Neanderthals, at least in Europe, were not good ancestors for the modern people that came after them. The Neanderthals were going off in their own evolutionary direction, particularly in the shape of their face. They were quite specialized away from modern humans. And so for me, the Neanderthals in Europe, at least, were not our ancestors. Yeah.
Because, you speculate that the Neanderthals and modern humans separated something like 400,000 years ago, didn't you? Or something like that?
Yes, I mean, on the genetic data we've got now, the separation time might be around 600,000 years. And that sounds a long time, but obviously geologically not that long.
Yeah.
But of course, this brings us to these difficult species questions. And I'm always asked, why do I call the Neanderthals a different species if they could interbreed with us? Because
exactly, that was the question I was going to ask.
That's one of the things that has changed our view of Neanderthals. So first of all, I think from, let's say, the year 2000 onwards, we start to gather a lot more data about the behavior of both early modern humans in Africa and Neanderthals in Europe and Asia. And first of all, there seemed to be lots of evidence from Africa, places like Southern Africa, of what seemed to be modern humans developing symbolism at an early date, making shell jewelry, using pigments a lot, engraving things. And some of this went back to 100,000 years ago. So to start with, this seemed to make modern humans, again, different from the Neanderthals. But then as people looked at Neanderthal sites in the same detail and excavated new sites and conducted new studies, it became clear that the Neanderthals were doing a lot of that stuff as well. So the gap narrowed between us and them. I mean, for some people, it's narrowed so completely there is no difference at 40,000 years ago. And I don't go that far, because I think with 600,000 years of evolution, that's time to develop differences in the skeleton, and they certainly did develop a number of differences from us in the skeleton, but also probably the brain evolution would have gone on somewhat different trajectories, and they did have big brains, as you've said. Their brains on average are slightly larger than the average today for modern people. But the interesting thing is that our brains have actually got smaller overall around the world in the last 10,000 years.
Really?
Probably because of our body size. So brain size scales to body size. So the bigger body you have on average, the bigger brain you'll have to go with that bigger body. So Neanderthals were big bodied, and our ancestors 50 or 100,000 years ago were also bigger bodied than we are today. More muscle mass, more body size, more bulk. And therefore, even the modern people of 40,000 years ago in Europe had bigger brains than modern Europeans.
Well, I'm amazed. I had no idea about that. I thought that our ancestors were smaller than us. I mean, I'm certainly bigger than my father.
So if you go back to the early, yes, that's right. If you go back to the earliest humans, so-called Homo habilis, Homo erectus, those individuals were smaller than many modern people today. But we have to bear in mind as well that when you look at people around the world, there are many very small-bodied people around in the world today. That we in Europe are large-bodied by comparison and tall compared with the average. Let's say for Southeast Asia, you look at populations there, and on average, they're a lot smaller than us. And populations in South America, for example, native populations there, on average, are smaller than Europeans. So there's a lot of variation. And so overall, yes, Neanderthals have got slightly bigger brains on average compared with us today, but compared with our ancestors, let's say the Cro-Magnons, if we can call them that, the people who lived in Europe that did the cave paintings, those people had bigger brains than us as well, and about the same size as the Neanderthals in brain size. But when you look at body size, they were also bigger bodied, but not quite as big bodied as the Neanderthals. So relatively, the Cro-Magnons had slightly bigger brains than Neanderthals when you take body size into account.
You mentioned Cro-Magnons. They are our species, are they? Are they Homo sapiens?
Yes, yes. I mean, they're the people. There's a site, like as we talk about Neanderthals, from the Neanderthal Valley site from 1856. So there was a similar site in France, the Cro-Magnon rock shelter, which produced some skeletons of early modern people. We now know they're about 30,000 years old, and those gave their name to this whole European group of early modern people who produced the upper Paleolithic industries, who painted Lascaux and Chauvet. These caves were produced by Cro-Magnons, if we keep using that term. And so I was measuring their skulls to compare with Neanderthal skulls, because if Loring Brace was right, those Cro-Magnons had directly descended from the preceding Neanderthals in the same areas. And on my data, they were quite different from each other. They were different in as much as we today are different from Neanderthals. Cro-Magnons also look very different from Neanderthals.
You mentioned the Cro-Magnon finding was about 30,000 years ago, which coincides with when the Neanderthals sort of disappeared.
Yes, in fact, they pretty certainly gone physically by 30,000. We think they disappeared physically around 40,000 years ago. Possibly they survived a little bit later in some places, but we really lose sight of them in terms of the fossil land, in terms of the archaeology we associate with Neanderthals. That disappears around 40,000 years ago. But of course, because we know Neanderthals interbred with us, they live on in us today, because
about 2%.
They interbred with us before they disappeared. And so people like you and me probably have around 2% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes.
Yeah.
From that interbreeding.
Is this interbreeding along the female line, though? Is it mitochondrial?
Well, it would have been everything. So, of course, if we could go back to that time, there was interbreeding going on between the two groups, and on some estimates, there was a Neanderthal contribution of maybe 10% into the modern human gene pool at that time, on some estimates. Now, that got selected down very quickly because some of that DNA, let's say, didn't work so well in the modern human genome, but some of it was beneficial. And we know that the immune systems, for example, of modern people, some of them certainly have genetic components in them. And so it was sort of swings and roundabouts, the interbreeding. I mean, we know that interbreeding between closely related species, which is actually quite common, we're very surprised to hear about it for Neanderthals and us, but in fact, it's quite common in nature that closely related species do interbreed. And it's a way of species to top up their diversity. By interbreeding with their closely related species, they regain a bit of lost diversity, which selection can work on. And that certainly happened for us with Neanderthal DNA. It introduced DNA which we had lost, and new DNA which we had not evolved in Africa. So having evolved in Africa, we had no natural immunities to European and Asian diseases, which Neanderthals had gained through evolving in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They'd evolved natural immunities. By interbreeding with them, we got a quick fix to our immune systems. And that was the good news that came from the interbreeding. Other aspects of the interbreeding were probably less advantageous. So we rapidly get a lot of that DNA removed until it fixes to about the 2% that we find today in most people outside of Africa.
Yes, Africans would not have Neanderthal DNA at all, would they?
Not from the original interbreeding, but of course that DNA has come back into Africa. There were probably ancient dispersals back into Africa that we've got a poor record of, but of course there was the expansion of the Roman Empire. There were trading networks down the East African coast. There was the spread of Islam. So all of those things would have reintroduced or brought in Neanderthal DNA in those populations, coming and mixing with African populations. One
thing that interests me about Neanderthal, I thought I'd seen evidence somewhere of Neanderthal artwork in caves, recent discoveries. I mean, do you know anything about this? Can you I mean,
it is disputed. Not everyone accepts the evidence, but I think I've mentioned that the evidence of symbolism, the fact that with early modern humans in Africa, we've got pendants jewelry made out of pierced shells, probably strung around people's necks or hands. And the Neanderthals seem to have been doing some of the same thing. We find pendants, in some cases made out of drilled animal teeth, that the Neanderthals clearly wore. There's some evidence that they were using eagle talons, perhaps, as jewelry. So this is quite sophisticated behavior. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, engravings. So there are some examples of engravings on bone, and also in Gibraltar at Gorham's Cave, there is what's called the hashtag. There's an engraving in the cave wall or the cave floor in Gibraltar, and it's covered by sediments which are associated with Neanderthal occupation. So it looks likely that that hashtag was engraved by one or more Neanderthals. So it's basic stuff, but it's comparable to the stuff we find of modern humans in Africa. And there's even suggestions that they were marking cave walls. So there are spots in red ochre that maybe were produced 65,000 years ago in Spanish caves. And the dating suggests that could only have been produced by Neanderthals. And one of the most remarkable things is that about 175,000 years ago, Neanderthals were going deep into a cave in France at Bruniquel, and they went deep into this cave, well beyond the daylight zone, and they built a couple of complex structures out of broken stalagmites.
Yes, I heard about that. I read
So
that.
they basically were breaking stalagmites to specific sizes, carrying them to one location, and basically dry stone walling the stalagmites into oval structures. And we don't know what on earth these structures are for. Are they symbolic? Are they functional, that they were actually living in the cave? This was during a cold stage. Maybe the cave was a more stable, warm environment. But to be down there, they had to have artificial light. They must have had torches that could sustain the light long enough for them to get down there and build these structures and presumably do something with the structures. So that's astonishingly complex behavior from 175,000 years ago. And we assume it has to be Neanderthal behavior. Of course, there's the faint possibility that modern humans could have been in these areas. So we have what seems to be an early Homo sapiens fossil from Greece, from a site called Epidima, that's, we think, is at least 210,000 years old. It's only the back of a skull, so we've got to be a bit careful about calling it a completely modern human, but it doesn't look Neanderthal. So if those people were there 200,000 years ago, is it possible they were spreading now and again into Europe? Is it possible they produced this Bruniquel structure? But I think we've got enough evidence of Neanderthal complexity to say that it's very likely the Bruniquel structure was made by Neanderthals.
Do you know what I think is so fascinating about this whole subject, this whole issue? It's not what we know, it's what we don't know. It's the questions, isn't it? It's just,
yes, that's right. And the last 10 years in particular has seen such an incredible growth of knowledge about us, about the Neanderthals, about these strange people called the Denisovans. There's the Hobbit,
I'll come to that later,
called over in Flores. These extraordinary discoveries are really expanding our horizons in all directions. And things are getting more complex rather than simpler in some ways. I would say the Neanderthal biology is becoming clearer. We've got CT scanning, so we can get these fantastic three-dimensional images of hidden structures such as the ear bones of the Neanderthals. And interestingly, those ear bones are as distinct from ours as, let's say, the ear bones of a chimpanzee are distinct from a gorilla's. So even down to these tiny little ear bones hidden in the inner ear and the middle ear, those bones are distinct in Neanderthals from ours.
Is there any clue there about the range of hearing that they can hear as distinct from us? Would they have heard the world in a different way?
Yeah, so obviously the middle ear is transmitting sounds. The middle bones of the middle ear are transmitting the sounds. The inner ear is also concerned with balance, and we think that the differences reflect more the different shapes of the skull, because obviously, as a Neanderthal baby grows up into an adult, its ear bones have to remain functional throughout all that time of growth, and they're a different shape. They grow as a different shape, so that the different skull shape is reflected by a slightly different orientation and shape of those ear bones to remain functional. Did have grown in a slightly different way, but it doesn't imply functional differences. As far as we know, on the modelling people have done, the hearing range of Neanderthals is similar to ours, and even from remains of what we think are very early Neanderthals from Atapuerca in Spain, there's a Cima del Huesos, the pit of the bones, deep in a cave near Burgos in Spain. They found a cache, a huge assemblage of probably 29 skeletons of early Neanderthals. They've even got DNA from them. And these early Neanderthals, I would call them that, at about 430,000 years old. We have the ear bones from them. We have a hyoid bone from the throat. and it implies that their hearing ranges were similar to ours, and at least as far as we can tell from the anatomy of the base of the skull and the throat, their capabilities were not much different in terms of sound. Maybe they had higher pitched voices. There's an argument that the vocal tract was not as deep as ours. That doesn't quite fit the butch Neanderthal image, that they had higher pitched voices, but that's a possibility. But I think in terms of functionality, the Neanderthals could probably make many of the sounds we can make. And I think language is made in the brain. So that's really where we need to get, is the Neanderthal brain, and to see whether that was capable of producing complex language. We can't answer that question at the moment. They've got a big brain, whether it was functioning in that way like ours. But when we look at Neanderthal culture, when we look at that Brunikel cave structure, when we look at them hunting dangerous wild animals, I think, you know, and living in relatively large groups, caring for their sick, it seems, burying their dead, I think you've got to assume they're talking to each other. They've got some kind of language. It could be very different from ours, but I would certainly give them speech and basic language capabilities. Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating. I mean, there's Broca's area in the brain in our species, which enables us to kind of make sense of the world and perhaps that help us talking. I don't know if there's any way that that can be compared with endocasts of Neanderthal brains.
People have done that. Some people think you can look at endocasts and get that kind of information. I'm very much more cautious. There are some differences in proportion in the brains. So the cerebellum is a different size in Neanderthals. The temporal lobe is a slightly different size. So there are proportional differences. But of course, as you know, so much of the complexity of the brain is in the internal wiring, in how all those bits are connected up to each other in the brain. And about that, we've got absolutely no idea for the Neanderthals.
I mean, the discovery of the hyoid bone in was it in Israel in the 1980s?
The Kibara.
Yeah, that must have been quite a big, quite a major discovery, I should think.
That's right, and it certainly showed that in that part of the throat anatomy, Neanderthals were close to modern humans. So there was no evidence there for a big difference in functionality of the voice box.
Yeah. I must say I could carry on about Neanderthals indefinitely. We've got other subjects to cover, I know.
Yes.
But do you have any thoughts about why Neanderthal occupation in Europe seemed to melt away when Cro-Magnons and more modern humans came along? Do you think there was some sort of conflict?
I think that, I mean, some people propose that we were at war with the Neanderthals for 100,000 years, and I don't think there's any evidence for that, really. I think that, as I've mentioned, there was apparently a modern human, an early Homo sapiens fossil anyway, in Greece at around 210,000, maybe a bit older. So that's evidence that at times modern humans came out of Africa earlier on, and they didn't take over from the Neanderthals. That site of Epidema actually has a Neanderthal fossil younger than the modern human, than the Homo sapiens one. So in that case, Homo sapiens was there maybe 210,000 years ago. By the time we get to 170,000 years ago, you've got Neanderthals there. So you've got a reverse replacement, a Neanderthal seemingly replacing a modern human group. And equally in Israel, we've got early Homo sapiens fossils at Shkul and Kafse at maybe 100 or 120,000 years ago. They then seem to disappear, and you have Neanderthals afterwards in Israel. So this replacement sometimes went in either direction. I think these are two human groups that in those earlier times were quite well matched in terms of their behavior and capabilities. And something different, I think, happened after let's say 45,000 years ago, because until then, there's no evidence that modern humans have the capability of replacing these other forms of humans. But after 45,000, there does seem to be something different, and those other species are replaced. Neanderthals are replaced in Europe and Asia. The Denisovans, who are over in the Far East and Southeast Asia, they disappear. The Homo floresiensis disappears. In Africa, there may well have been archaic humans there that also disappeared in that time period. So something in human adaptive capabilities, I think, change more than anything. I don't think there are big changes in our anatomy or in our brains, but I think human societies grew in complexity. We grew in networking. We grew in numbers. We also were maybe in some ways energetically more efficient, because there's evidence that people like the Neanderthals and Homo erectus had much bigger lung capacity, maybe 20% larger lung capacity. They required a lot more energy for their day-to-day activities. They had high body masses, high muscle masses. Their internal organs were larger. So they're energetically, if you like, a slightly less efficient model of human than we were. So we have a smaller rib cage, smaller lungs, smaller internal organs, less muscle. So we're not using as many resources from the landscape. We're a bit more efficient in that sense. So that could have been part of the reason why we succeeded. And I think we got lucky as well, because I think Neanderthals had suffered constant attrition from the fluctuations of climate in Europe and Asia. There's the big ice age changes that happen about every 100,000 years. But within those, there are these tiny fluctuations. Well, not tiny in terms of the effect. They were massive changes in temperature that occurred within a few hundred or thousand years. So the climate of the Earth in Europe, the Atlantic, would go from being as warm as it is today to being frozen in the winter. So you get this change happening. And some of these changes on the ice core records happen in less than 10 years. So imagine that. You're in Europe, you're a Neanderthal, everything you're familiar with in your lifetime changes. All the animals that you're familiar with disappear, all the plants disappear, and they're replaced for fairly rapidly, maybe in your lifetime, by plants that are adapted to a completely new climate. So
that's all beginning to sound quite modern.
Sorry?
It's all beginning to sound quite current. I mean, we see.
Yes, we've got this ahead of us, probably, unfortunately, with climate change, but in the opposite direction. So there's fluctuations that went from nearly as warm as today to really as bad as the worst of an ice age in some ways, in scores of years, maybe even less than 10 years in some cases. And so the Neanderthals suffered this attrition over and over again. From about 100,000 years ago, there were a number of these rapid changes: warm to cold, warm to cold, cold to warm, warm to cold. And I think they didn't have a stable playing field. They didn't have a level playing field. They were constantly battling this climate change. So when things improved, they would expand northwards. They'd come to Britain, they'd come to Northern Europe. And then within maybe 1,000 years, the climate crashes again, and all of those populations in the north die out. And you've just got those survivors in the south that then have to regather their strength and repopulate. So this happened again and again. And I think Neanderthal diversity, genetic diversity, seems to have been pruned down. They ended up being much less diverse than we are today. And also, I think that in some cases, they look like they were relatively inbred. Because of those lower population numbers, they were interbreeding with each other, which genetically we know can be bad news as well. So I think the Neanderthals, by 40,000 years ago, were probably already a species in trouble. And then they have a competing species that coexists with them, wanting to hunt the same animals, collect the same plant resources, live in the best caves and valleys and environments. And there was probably an economic competition, and maybe there was no purposeful conflict, but modern humans, as we're doing now to much of the world and much of the fauna and flora of the world, we don't want to kill off orangutans, but if we, remove their environment and remove their food, they will die out. And maybe the extinction of Neanderthals was in some way an accident of the success of modern humans. It could be that that's what was happening 40,000 years ago.
Do you think it's the same story for Denisovans and Florentians?
Well, we simply don't know for those ones, because we don't know exactly when they disappeared. But there's evidence from Flores that yes, the Flores population was still there 50,000 years ago, perhaps from archaeology. But by 47,000 years ago, we seem to have a couple of modern human teeth in the site. So maybe there was a replacement around that time. For the Denisovans, it's a bit more puzzling, their extinction, because they were much more widespread than the Neanderthals in terms of a north-south gradient. So the Denisovans were up in Siberia at times. They were probably also down in the islands of Southeast Asia at times. So they were much more widespread. They were genetically more diverse, as far as we can tell, than the Neanderthals were. Mm-hmm. So their disappearance is maybe a bit more of a mystery, but they also have gone, let's say, by 30,000 years ago, as far as we know. But of course, we have a pretty poor fix. They maybe disappeared from Denisova Cave by 45,000 years ago. We don't know when they disappeared in Southeast Asia. And because some modern populations down there in Southeast Asia have quite a high level of Denisovan DNA as well as Neanderthal DNA. So in some populations, the level of Denisovan DNA today is at about 3%. So they have around 2% Neanderthal DNA plus about 3% of Denisovan DNA from Denisovan interbreeding. And on some analyses, that Denisovan interbreeding happened in Southeast Asia. That would suggest that the Denisovans were down there and they may have survived longer. That may even have been their core territory down in Southeast Asia. And they interbred with modern humans on the way to Australia and New Guinea, for example. Those populations took Denisovan DNA with them. And that's something we have an awful lot to learn about. When you think how much we know about Neanderthals, there's this huge area down there where we know so little about what was going on with those early human populations, how they lived, how they adapted, how they interacted with modern humans, and when did they disappear. We don't know.
I think the development of ideas of Denisovans has been gathering at an amazing pace. I mean, I didn't hear anything about them until, I suppose, about 10 years ago, something like that. It must have been longer.
That's when we all learned. Yeah.
But this is based on three teeth and a finger bone.
Well, the original finds, yes, that's right. So, of course, Russian archaeologists have been digging Denisova Cave for many years before that. So they had found lots of animal remains, artifacts, and, of course, these fragmentary human fossils, so fragmentary that it was difficult to know what they were. So when the first DNA was recovered from that finger bone, a tiny bit of finger bone, it was a surprise because people thought it was probably a Neanderthal or a modern human. But instead, it was a third kind of human, which became known as Denisovans. And as you say, we've got DNA now from dental remains. There are some very large teeth that have also given up DNA. There's also now some skull fragments from the site. What's remarkable is the Neanderthals were living at Denisova Cave as well, and they alternated or maybe even coexisted in the cave over a period of probably at least 100,000 years. Incredible that these populations were in the times of bad climate, they probably vacated the area entirely, but when the climate was reasonable, maybe at times both groups migrated and dispersed and came to Denisova Cave. And we know that they even interbred, at least in the locality, because there is incredibly what seems to be a first generation hybrid nicknamed Denny. It's a girl who had one Neanderthal parent and one Denisovan parent. So that's an incredible discovery.
That is amazing.
That exists. And that's only from a bone fragment. So you couldn't tell that from just looking at the fossil itself. That's from the DNA evidence. So that's the beginning of the Denisovan story. But we can now extend it to the Tibetan plateau of China, probably, because there's a jawbone from a cave, a high altitude cave up at about 3,000 meters in the Tibetan plateau. That cave had produced a jawbone, which was sacred to Tibetan monks who had venerated it. And when it was analyzed, it was shown to be an archaic human, very big teeth, and unfortunately, no DNA was recovered from it, but some protein material was recovered from it, which most closely resembles the Denisovan cave population rather than Neanderthals or modern humans. So that jawbone is probably a Denisovan. And to back that up, in the cave sediment of the cave it came from, by a sheer cave, they have found Denisovan mitochondrial DNA actually in the sediment of the cave, covering a period of at least 50,000 years. So it's an astonishing story. The Denisovans were up at high altitude on the Tibetan plateau. The jawbone is at least 160,000 years old. So that seems to extend the Denisovan story to the Tibetan plateau. And a lot of us suspect that some Chinese fossils elsewhere, there's a jawbone, for example, from off the coast of Taiwan, from a site called Penghu, that has great big molar teeth, and it looks like the one from Zhahe. That also could be a Denisovan jawbone. There are some fossil skulls from China, such as Dali and Jinushan. And my guess is that when we know more about them, if we ever have their DNA, I would guess they're going to turn out to be Denisovans. But for the Denisovans in Southeast Asia, we haven't got anything we can point at in the fossil record to say those are Denisovan fossils. They were probably in Sumatra, Borneo, Sulawesi, but there's not a single human fossil there to show what they look like. We've got Homo erectus carrying on in Indonesia. We've got the hobbit Homo floresiensis on the island of Flores. We've got Homo luzonensis, another dwarf species in the Philippines. So none of those look likely to be Denisovans. Somewhere else in Southeast Asia, there must be fossil evidence of Denisovans waiting to be recovered.
So we're finding more and more remains of more different people, more subspecies of human beings.
I would call them species, different species. Yeah.
Different species of human beings.
Yes.
So are these finds that have been happening over the last 18 months or 2 years?
Well, the Denisovan stories developed over the last 10 years, Homo luzonensis the last couple of years. Homo floresiensis, of course, was published first of all in 2004. So they're all pretty recent finds. And of course, in Africa, we shouldn't forget Homo naledi. So down in South Africa, in an area that we thought we knew pretty well for the last 500,000 years, it turns out that there was a very primitive species surviving there around 300,000 years ago. And its remains, again, deep in a cave system near Johannesburg, a place which, you know, the cavers were going into that cave regularly for years.
Oh, this is the cave that you're going down and down and down, wasn't it? Yes, I know about that.
Yeah. So this site has been visited by cavers regularly for many years, but in a nearly inaccessible chamber. There's a number of, there are hundreds or thousands of fossils of this species Homo naledi, which has a very small brain, really an ape-sized brain, basically, a skeleton which combines some quite advanced features. So the hand and feet look very like ours, but the shoulders look like they were still climbing around in trees or climbing up and down rock faces. A small brain, as I say, and so far, no real explanation of how those bones got deep into this cave in an inaccessible area. And the people excavating the site, their argument is that these Homo naledi people were disposing of their dead deep in that cave through these incredibly complex chambers somehow.
Amazing. Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to me that there's so many different kinds of, it's not hominid.
You can call those I'd call them all humans.
Humanoid. You call them all humans?
Yeah.
You call them all humans?
Well, genus Homo for me is human. Different people use the term differently, but I think anyone in the genus Homo we can call human. We can argue about, I mean, Homo floresiensis, some people think that that's actually a more primitive survivor, even more like an Australopithecine, an earlier kind of pre-human form, that somehow got across to Flores and survived there for 2 million years. That would be an even more extraordinary story. But we don't know for sure where Homo floresiensis came from. Many people think it's a dwarf form of this other species, Homo erectus. So we have a lot to learn about floresiensis and where it came from.
Because DNA analysis must make an enormous difference, because it's only through DNA, as far as I can tell, that you can tell you can decide whether someone's a different species or whether they're just an unfortunate individual of the same species. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I mean, some people had argued that floresiensis was a pathological Homo sapiens.
Exactly, that's what I'm trying to say.
Now we know that lineage, in fact, goes deep on Flores, that there's a partial jawbone and tiny teeth 700,000 years old on the island, which looks like an ancestral population. So we're not talking about a disease Homo sapiens, but you're right. If we had the DNA, it would really help us. But of course, this is a warm, wet cave in a tropical, subtropical area. So DNA survival is going to be a very long shot, but possibly proteins, which is the other way of looking at proteins, can survive better than DNA. And just as we've got protein material from that Jahe jawbone on the Tibetan plateau, linking it with Denisovans, if we can get protein material from Homo floresiensis, from Homo erectus, from Homo luzonensis, that may start to help us place these other forms in relation to us, to the Neanderthals, to the Denisovans. And we can start to build up a bigger network of genetic material, even if it's not DNA itself.
I mean, one thing that, just coming back to the Neanderthals into Europe thing, one thing that struck me as really interesting is about the Sahara, the effect that the Sahara must have had, because sometimes it's desert, sometimes it's forest, sometimes it's jungle. And when it's desert, it must have been impenetrable. So I'm imagining the Sahara Desert as a kind of door that's opening and shutting, allowing people in and then stopping people from coming in, which presumably allows and facilitates the diaspora, the dispersion of species, which is quite interesting. Have you got any thoughts about how people, what route they took to get out of Africa? Because the Middle East wasn't always just there. Sometimes the Mediterranean was quite dry. So have you got any thoughts about how they might have come into Europe, or is that?
Yeah, well, first of all, on the Sahara, yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, the climate has changed dramatically at times. When the Sahara is well watered with plenty of rain, then it was covered in networks of lakes and rivers. And there were even hippos, you know, in lakes and rivers in the middle of what's now the Sahara Desert. And the same for Arabia. Arabia at times had the same network of rivers and lakes when the climate was different. So these areas at times will draw in human populations to colonize them. And these, as you say, could become pathways across vast areas when it's the right conditions. But at other times, as you say, they're an impassable barrier for early humans, certainly, who didn't have the capability to cross those vast distances at that time. So I think in terms of getting out of Africa, the most likely route is still via the Sinai area of northeast Africa. Some people favour the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which would take you from the Horn of Africa, basically, straight into Arabia. At times of low sea level, that would have been only a crossing of a few miles. So some people think that could have been used for humans to exit Africa. I think it's a possibility, but I don't think we need that route, because I think the northern route would have been passable for a lot of the time for early humans. And of course, we've got to bear in mind, it isn't a one-way traffic that we often talk about out of Africa, and I certainly have an awful lot in my career. But of course, populations could also come the other way. And we haven't yet got evidence of Neanderthals in Arabia. There's a finger bone from Al Worcester that looks like a modern human one that's maybe 90,000 years old. But at times, maybe the Neanderthals got into Arabia. At times, maybe they even got into North Africa. We don't know yet. So, our knowledge is partial. The Neanderthals, we know, extended through parts of Israel and Jordan. Maybe at times they could have even got into parts of North Africa, but we don't have the evidence at the moment.
That's fascinating. Okay. Let me ask you, how would you describe your latest idea about multi-regional African origin? Can you put that in simple layman's terms?
Yeah, so I think for maybe the last 20 years, I've sort of realized that the picture in Africa was not a simple story either of our evolving in one place. Where the modern human features were developed and the modern human behavior developed. It might have been East Africa or South Africa. And then modern humans, having evolved relatively rapidly, then spread from that single center and took over the world. I think it's much more complicated than that now, because as we build up our fossil record in Africa and we start to date the fossils more precisely, we can see it's a more complicated story. So I've already mentioned Homo naledi, at 300,000 years down in South Africa, a really quite primitive kind of human. Earlier this year, we dated the Broken Hill skull from Zambia, which I regard as Homo heidelbergensis, again, a more primitive species than us or Neanderthals. That also seems to be about 300,000 years old. And up in Morocco, at about that date, we've got what seems to be an early Homo sapiens fossils, in fact, from a site called Jebel Ihud. So even at 300,000 years ago, we've got three different kinds of humans in Africa. And when you look at the gaps between Morocco and Zambia and Johannesburg, near enough for Homo naledi, you've got huge gaps in between where there is virtually no fossil evidence at all of who was living in Central and West Africa for that entire period of time. We know from stone tools people were there, but we haven't got a single fossil from Central or West Africa for that period to tell us who was there. So I think even the picture we have now is oversimplified for Africa, and that when we build up our picture, we will see that Africa is a huge area, populated in some places nearly continuously through the last million years. In other regions, as you've mentioned, like the Sahara, sporadic occupation. So I think when the climates were good, these populations expanded and contacted each other and exchanged ideas and genes. And at other times, they were pinned back into refugia when the times were bad. And some of these groups died out. But overall, when we look at the last 300,000 years, modern humans will be an assembly of different populations contributing to what we call modern humans.
We're human mongrels.
Yeah, so I've tended to call it a multi-regional model, but I think my colleagues are sensitive to the use of that word because, of course, there is this multi-regional model of evolution, which was around in the 1980s and is still around for some people today, whereby modern humans evolved all over the world together with gene flow. So Africa wasn't any more important than any other region. So Homo erectus in China evolved into modern Chinese. Homo erectus in Java evolved into modern native Australians. Neanderthals and the earlier Heidelbergensis in Europe evolved into modern Europeans. And in Africa, we'd have a sequence from Homo heidelbergensis through to modern Africans with gene flow. So these don't speciate, they're all part of one evolving species, which you'd have to call Homo sapiens. So that's the classic multi-regional model. I think it's clearly wrong because most of our ancestry comes from Africa, but with the additions of the interbreeding with these other groups adding to the complexity. So we're not 100% recent African origin. Let's say we're more than 90% recent African origin.
Well, that brings me on.
Yeah.
That brings me on nicely to a question that's always been on my mind. I don't think it's ever been answered to my satisfaction anyway. You talk about searching for remains, and you refer to the vast spaces of Africa and Europe and Asia. But over such huge areas, where do you start your search? I mean, where do you begin? I mean, does it always begin with a chance discovery, or is there some other way of saying, oh, well, the Olduvai Gorge is a good place to start because for some other reason? I mean,
yeah,
all by chance?
Sometimes there are chance events. So obviously some of the British fossil record have been found by chance. So the Swanscombe skull from Kent, which is about 400,000 years old, that was recovered from a working gravel pit, the 3 pieces of the Swanscombe skull. And the Boxgrove site, where we've got a tibia and a couple of teeth, that site was under active quarrying, but luckily they allowed archaeologists in to excavate certain of the sensitive areas, the critical areas, before they were quarried away. So it's only through quarrying activity. The Broken Hill skull, found in 1921 in Zambia, was found in mining operations. They were basically quarrying away a hillside that had cave chambers running through it. And they were, until that skull turned up, it seems they were smelting piles of animal bones and putting them in the smelter because they were covered in metal ore. Now imagine what was lost when they were doing that. It doesn't bear thinking about. So the Broken Hill skull, again, a chance discovery, but other finds are more systematic. So of course, you've mentioned Olduvai Gorge, and Louis Leakey was aware that stone tools had been found there. And so in the 1930s, he began a program of digging, but it took him another, 25, 30 years before he found the first significant fossil humans. In fact, his wife, Mary Leakey, was the one who found that so-called Zinjanthropus boisei, nutcracker man, that wonderful skull of what we now call Paranthropus boisei. So it took 30 years or more of work, really tedious work, to find that first find. So
that's a huge investment.
He got lucky.
You might not get.
Yeah, that's it. Another find. So the Australopithecus africanus, that first find again was from a limestone quarry. But other people are being more systematic. So in Ethiopia, of course, you can use satellite imagery to look at the landscape in great detail. You can see where the rivers are cutting through sediments of particular ages, where that will be a good place to look for fossils. In South Africa now, because of the rising star discovery, this has opened up exploration of, caves, huge numbers of caves down there, which are beginning to be explored. The Atapuerca sites near Burgos in northern Spain, remarkably there, the first discoveries of some of those finds came from a railway cutting. So an Anglo-Spanish mining company blasted a ravine through a hillside to run a railway track in the early 1900s, which was later on abandoned. But by chance, unknown to them, they had broken through a number of ancient cave systems. And in those cave systems, afterwards, in the last 30 years, the Atapuerca team have found fantastic fossils and artifacts, including human fossils. So Homo antecessor, this early European species, maybe 850,000 years old, that was found in the deposits exposed by this railway cutting made in the 1900s. And that led on to systematic excavations in the area to map out more precisely what was there.
I mean, all this suggests that there's a lot more yet to find, doesn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
You mentioned satellite imagery, but the rest of it seems to be, you know, very much a question of chance.
Yeah, and I think the Floresiensis find and the Luzonensis find show us that even these islands of Southeast Asia, where most of us thought ancient humans couldn't possibly have got to them because they're so remote, each of them might have an experiment like Homo floresiensis or Homo luzonensis going on those islands. So those also now, all the caves in those islands, some of them certainly are being looked at now for more discoveries. And we've got Asia, huge areas of Asia. In India, the subcontinent of India only has one significant ancient human fossil in the whole of the Indian subcontinent. And of course, we know from archaeology there are ancient people there. Again, huge amount to be learnt there.
Can I just move on to something a little bit more fanciful? It's inconceivable that we could ever reconstruct dinosaurs, as suggested in Steven Spielberg movies. But I believe there is work going on in Russia, at least, to reconstruct mammoth DNA and impregnate an elephant. Is that something you're aware of, that you can explain a little more? And would there be any ethical issues for you?
Yeah, well, we do hear about these in the popular press. How realistic it really is, I think, remains to be seen. Yeah, I think there are certainly big ethical issues about bringing back an extinct creature like the mammoth, whose original ecosystem has disappeared. I think we've got enough trouble conserving the species we've got on Earth now, let alone bringing back ones that died out in ancient times and no longer have a natural environment in which to live. And I guess that's going to bring you on to the Neanderthals and whether we're ever going to clone a Neanderthal. And I would say, there you're probably talking more likely a plausibility will be to take, because the Neanderthals are so close to us genetically, if you were going to do it, you could maybe use a gene editing technology and take a modern human genome and actually edit in the Neanderthal bits of DNA. That way you could create an artificial Neanderthal genome. So I guess that's the way, I hope it's never done, but that would be a more plausible way of doing it than trying to work from ancient DNA, which obviously is damaged and degraded. So that's probably,
doing that, you're actually adapting a modern human being.
I mean, and in terms of plausibility, Mark Thomas, colleague at UCL, geneticist, I heard him say that when people 10 years ago said, "Are we ever going to clone a Neanderthal?" he would laugh a lot. Now he only laughs a little bit. So, in other words, I think someone with enough arrogance and I would say stupidity might attempt to do it. I hope it's never done, because imagine that it actually works and you end up with a Neanderthal baby. This baby has to be born of a human mother, so it's got to have human rights. You can't then, put it in a zoo or conduct experiments on it. You've got to let that Neanderthal child grow up as a child with full human rights. So
I would definitely have a problem.
Of course, I'd be fascinated to know whether a Neanderthal child could learn a modern human language, the one we're speaking now. That would be fantastic to know, but I don't want anyone to do that genetic experiment to investigate it. I'd rather stick with the evidence we've got from 40 or 50,000 years ago. Yeah,
I agree with you absolutely. Just to round off, just a couple of personal questions now. Whenever I visit the Natural History Museum, you know what it means to me. I'm filled with warm memories of my childhood days there. It almost feels like I'm going home, and I've developed a deep affection for the old building, which I still think of as a kind of cathedral, dedicated to knowledge and the pursuit of truth. And in fact, it was designed that way, to be cathedral-like. And I imagine you must have similar feelings, but what must it be like to be paid to work in a place like that? I mean, I'm so jealous. I mean, Do you still feel that magic when you go in there every day, or is it just a place of work to you after so many years?
I think it varies according to how things are going, but in general, I mean, I haven't been in the building sadly for months, of course, with
No.
the COVID lockdown, and I miss it very much.
Mm.
Yes, I mean, when I first worked at the museum, we had a key pound for all the staff. So you would go in through the front door, and just to the left as you came in, there would be a pound where you would sign out your key for the day, and you'd go and unlock your room and get into the department. It also meant, of course, your head of department could phone in and find out who hadn't come to work that day. That's another story.
Yeah.
But that meant you went through that door and you came into that hall every day. Now, unfortunately, we don't go in that way now normally. There's now a staff entrance on Exhibition Road, which is our way in. So I don't have the pleasure every day of going through that front door and into the main hall. But of course, the pleasure is that under normal working conditions, I can go and look at that hall anytime I want. And it's as inspiring to me now as it was when I was a little boy going there, even before Dippy was there. So everyone thinks
I can remember that too.
Yeah, but I remember pre-Dippy, when my parents first took me there.
Yeah.
I think there were elephants and large, stuffed mammals in that area of the hall rather than Dippy. So I remember pre-Dippy. And yeah, I mean, seeing the human evolution exhibits back then, I remember asking, there was the Broken Hill skull on show there. In fact, I know now it was a replica made by Maurice Wilson, that artist again. He produced the exhibit and he put a jawbone on it from another fossil. And I remember seeing that exhibit and with my parents and saying, "Oh, I'd love to have that. I'd love to have a copy of that." And I said, "Can you go and ask that man there?" And there was a warder standing there with his uniform. And my parents went and asked whether they ever had any spare copies so I could have one. And the guy came over and patted me on the head. He said, "No, sorry, we don't have any copies, but you can find pictures of it and postcards of it down in our bookshop." And sure enough, parents bought me a postcard of the Broken Hill skull.
I went there so often. I got to know some of the wardens.
Right. Yeah.
I realised that they were very enthusiastic about some of the stuff that was there. And there was a couple of wardens there who used to tell me about a new exhibit when they saw me come through the door. Said, "Oh, there's a new exhibit on such and such, or wherever." And I used to be thrilled, that they'd remember me. And
yes, the museum used to run Saturday morning nature clubs, of course, and I don't know whether you ever went to those. But they were also, a number of people that I encounter now that started their interest in natural history from those Saturday morning clubs that the museum used to run. Yeah.
I used to sit through the lectures at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They had a regular lecture session there. And I used to sit through it. I mean, you had all these professors and doctors sitting around, and here was I, about 9 years old, didn't understand a word of what was being said, but I felt very sort of important and watched it. So just to close then, I mean, which past scientists, and we're talking about past scientists, not living ones, do you most admire in your particular field? I mean, and why were they the biggest players in anthropology, in your opinion? Where were the iconoclasts?
Yes. Well, obviously, I mean, Charles Darwin, of course, the Descent of Man, that book laid out, a number of the questions that we're still trying to address about our origins. Why do we walk upright? How do we start to talk?
Yeah.
All those questions that we still grapple with. So obviously that book's still essential reading. And when we come on to fossil discoveries, I mentioned some of these people already. People like Raymond Dart, a real pioneer of discovering a whole phase of human evolution, Plithocines, and Louis Leakey and Mary, his wife, who also did hugely important work following on from Lewis. At Olduvai Gorge, she then worked at Laetoli. So they were very important in opening up East Africa for human evolution studies.
Did you ever meet them?
Yeah. I spoke to Louis Leakey on the phone once only, before he died. Mary Leakey, yes, I shared a flight with her to Nice, she kept plying me with gin and tonics, so that was really quite enjoyable. I don't remember much of it because of the gin and tonics, but it was enjoyable. And I think Bill Howells, so William Howells, and he had, I mentioned one of those Scientific American articles I read as a little boy. So later on, I spent 6 months teaching at Harvard in 1979, and so Bill Howells was there. And even before that, he had very generously given his fossil and recent human cranial data. So my PhD, I went around Europe, and you mentioned my Morris Minor car that I drove around Europe for 4 months on a 5,000
Probably, you
mile
probably learned more about
road trip.
the car mechanics than that.
Yeah, yes, it did go wrong a few times, but I remember the exhaust broke in half. The cobbled roads in the what was then Czechoslovakia, the roads were appalling, and the cobbled roads wrecked the exhaust of my Morris 1000. And of course, in Czechoslovakia, there was nowhere to get parts for a Morris 1000, but I did find a workshop where a guy kindly got hold of a load of coat hangers and somehow welded my exhaust back together again with melted coat hangers. It was an incredible bit of work. So yeah, these adventures. But I was measuring fossil skulls on that trip, of course, of Neanderthals and modern humans and so on. But Bill Howes generously donated me his entire data set of modern human skull measurements from all around the world. So he and his wife Muriel, and she deserves a lot of credit for that, he spent years of his life measuring skulls from all around the world. He came to the Natural History Museum and so on, and he donated me that data for my PhD, and that was my core assessment of what modern human variation was based on his generosity of giving me that data. And so it's a lesson for us all today, because unfortunately, you know, some fossil discoveries remain inaccessible 15, 20 years or more after they've been found. And there's a famous example I can mention. On my PhD trip, I had written ahead of time to the Musée de l'Homme in Paris to see this skull from Jebel Ihud in Morocco. It had been found in the 1960s. It had been called an African Neanderthal. It was thought to be 40,000 years old, but it was still very mysterious. Nobody had really had a good look at it. So I wrote to Paris whether I could study it. When I got there, the curator who was in charge of it said, "I'm very sorry, but it's gone back to Morocco. I'm sorry to tell you, we don't have it anymore." The next morning at coffee, I was talking to another curator who said, "What do you mean? It's in his room, in a cupboard." So that curator then said, "Look, come back tomorrow morning. He's not here for the morning. I've got a key. You can have 2 hours to look at Jebel Ihud tomorrow morning." And that guy generously got me in to look at Jebel Ihud. And that was really important, because it showed me that Jebel Ihud was not an African Neanderthal. It was a completely different kind of human. And that became important.
I think that's quite disturbing. I remember somebody once said that the general public think of science as a celestial, and he said, "No, it's not. It's terrestrial, definitely."
Yes, I mean, there's the contrast of Bill Howes' generosity and that guy who wanted to keep that skull to himself. So these are the different, these run side by side. Most scientists I know are open and collaborative, and I've got some fantastic collaborative networks all over the world with people. And that is the way forward. Open data and making your publications and data available as widely as you can.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Just one other question then. Do you have any new books on the way?
Well,
the latest.
In my head, I've got a book, yes, which I'm beginning to work on. These books take 1 or 2 years to write. So I should mention The Human Story. You mentioned that at the beginning, our museum publication. That's written with my colleague, Louise Humphrey. So Louise Humphrey deserves at least 50% of the credit for that book, Our Human Story. And of course, every year it needs updating. So we've got to get another update in soon, because
we have to get an update every year. So just to address our readers, here it is, dear reader. This is the book that all subscribers stand to win. Humanistically Speaking is going to purchase 6 copies, and the winners will be drawn from our list of subscribers. So if you're not a subscriber now, do send us a text with the word subscribe on it and give yourself a chance to win. But even if you don't win, I mean, 15 quid, I'm not kidding. This is an amazing book, and I shall treasure this. I think it's a wonderful book, full of photographs and illustrations, which are absolutely fascinating. I must read. And Chris, I'd just like to say thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed this interview. It's been amazing, and I shall play it and replay it and enjoy it. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for the fascinating interview and a wonderful book.
It's been a great pleasure. And yes, if we're both still around in 2 or 3 years' time, let's do it again and see what's changed by then.
Oh, I would love that. That'd be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.